Okay, I'm very happy to be here in Zurich. It's not my first time here, and it's always good to be back with friends, with Konrad, of course, and Samuel, and other friends. Axel, I thought about it right now that we met for the first time in 1988. So we are celebrating the 30th anniversary of knowing each other. Yes. So Axel, of course, and me, we worked together in the past. So anyway, I'm very happy to be here. On the request of Konrad, my friend, I prepared 3 seminars for you. The first one, as you can see, is about the archaeology behind, as far as I understand, of course, the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. In my opinion, there are Hasmonean realities there. The second will be on my work in the Negev Highlands. It will be very different from this one in the sense that I will be speaking more about the exact and life sciences there. So this is more text archaeology oriented than the second one, and this is on purpose to give lectures of different types. The second one will be more on archaeology and the exact and life sciences, and the third one on Megiddo will be more on excavation of a very important site and of course, deploying all sorts of methods and techniques in order to be able to shed light on historical questions. So this is the program. Now, I know that we have a seminar, each seminar is an hour and a half, and I think that I should plan for like an hour and 15 minutes and then open for questions, something like that. I must admit that it is a little bit, maybe too much what I prepared for each lecture. So I'm going to do the following. I will go not very quickly, as much as we manage to see and speak about, that's good for me. Because much of what I'm going to do today is a demonstration, more than the details of this or that topic that I'm going to speak about. So if we miss, a little bit at the end, nothing bad happened and we will survive. So this will also be regarding the policy, my policy regarding the first lecture. So the first seminar is about Hasmonean realities behind Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles, the archaeology perspective. I must say that it was almost a coincidence or not, maybe divine intervention, that yesterday I received on my desk at the university the book which has now been published by SBL under the same title, which means that in the last few years, and I'll explain why in a minute, I published several articles on this question, and then I assembled them by also putting them into some sort of the same line of thinking and the same method, and the book is now out by SBL probably 2 weeks ago or so, because yesterday I received it at Tel Aviv University. Now, of course, you know that I am not a qualified text person as biblical scholars, which means I'm not completely ignorant in biblical scholarship, but I'm not a text person. So I'm coming from the side of archaeology. However, I think that in the last 25 years, I invested quite a lot of time and effort in order not to be completely naive about biblical scholarship, which means that I think that I know basically what's going on in scholarship on a topic which I start dealing with. And I think that I know where the weak points are. Of course, I know the weak points of archaeology, but I'm not going to disclose them to you. But I know very well, I know very well the weak points in biblical scholarship argumentation, although I admire many of the biblical scholars. I think I admire biblical scholars. If you give me a list of people who really deserve to be admired, I think there will be more biblical scholars there than archaeologists, I suppose. But still, this is the point where I depart from. Let's start by saying that why am I dealing with the Persian period, Persian and early Hellenistic period? As you know, for several years I devoted my time to deal with the questions of the 10th century. The archaeology of the United, well, also before, of course, but the archaeology of the rise of ancient Israel, the archaeology of the United Monarchy, and later. And dealing with these topics, I discovered the weak points in biblical scholarship, but also in the reconstruction of the ancient history of Israel and archaeology. And I understood the methodological problems which were involved with the questions of the 10th century. And then, after a while, I became fed up a little bit with the 10th century. You know, my way of doing scholarship is that I'm not putting myself in a trench to fight off people who reject what I'm saying until the end of times. This is not my way. After a while, I become a little bit tired and fed up. I say to myself, well, they can continue writing whatever they wish. I said what I have to say. Forget it, I'm going to continue. And I pick up another topic because this is the way to keep myself interested in what I'm doing. So after a while, when I became a little bit fed up with and tired of the big debate over chronology and 10th century and United Monarchy and so on, I noticed that the same, not exactly the same, but similar kind of problems haunt the discussion, in my opinion, of the Persian and early Hellenistic period. What I discovered is the following, that the Persian and early Hellenistic period became a fad, a mode among biblical scholarship. Today, if you go to biblical scholarship, you open, 10 books that are published, let's say, recently, you run some sort of a survey, and you see that the tendency is to, especially, I must say, well, not only, all over the world, but maybe a little bit more so in Europe, to push as many biblical texts into the Persian and early Hellenistic periods, which means to the 5th, 4th, 3rd centuries BC, maybe also the beginning of the 2nd century. And I noticed that there are several big problems with this tendency, even before going into the text evaluation, which I respect very much. But even before going to text exegesis, there are many questions that need to be verified. Regarding the reality, text must be, in my opinion, or I'm sure that you all agree with me, must be evaluated on the background of a certain reality. And you have to pick up the reality and then check whether it fits or not. So I noticed problems with the reality behind this tendency in the last, more than before, in the last 20, 30 years. So first of all, there is almost no extra biblical evidence. So we are really into something which is sort of, a closed pot, which we steer time and again, but we are in a big risk of circular argumentation when we do this. You know that regarding, let's say, the province of Yehud in the Persian period, as far as I can now remember, there are maybe 1 or 2 extra biblical texts. I mean, if you take Persian and early Hellenistic, let's say 5th and 4th centuries BC, so there is the Wadi Dalia documents, and then of course there is Elephantine with a single letter which reflects on Jerusalem. So the extra biblical evidence is very meager, if at all existing. The second question is that, and I'll get back to it at the end of this discussion, and this is something that I'm not going to skip because it's important, and I don't have it here on the screen right now. There's a major problem regarding scribal activity. Major problem, which means there is very strong evidence for scribal activity in the later phase of the Iron Age. You all know this. In the 7th century, Judah is a writing society, so to speak. Of course, not every peasant in a godforsaken village can write, but the understanding of the impact of the medium of writing is there. I don't know whether you are aware of the fact that we have a very strong group at Tel Aviv University. We do digital epigraphy, which means we combine, there are several mathematicians and physicists with us, archaeologists and epigraphists, and we deploy methodologies from computer science and mathematics in order to try to deal with ancient First Temple or so, Iron Age epigraphy, especially Ostraka. And we have recently, maybe 2 years ago, dealt with the Arad inscriptions in order to answer the question of the kind of literacy that was prevalent in Judah in around 600 BC, the dissemination of knowledge of writing and reading, of literacy. And so we developed, I mean, not me, not myself, but our mathematicians developed an algorithm and a certain system in order to compare handwritings in Ostrakhan. And regarding Arad, we came to the conclusion that among the 16 Ostrakhan that we checked, that we investigated, we could identify altogether, I mean, I'm not going to describe the whole process here, about 5 or 6 authors, writers. This is amazing. I mean, if you think about Arad, which is a God-forsaken place on the margin of Judah in the desert. So if you extrapolate from Arad now to the rest of the Beersheba Valley, to other important places like Lachish and others, to Jerusalem, to the entourage around the king, and so on, you get a meaningful number. I'm not going to try even to offer a number, but the number must be some sort of significant vis-a-vis the total population of Judah. Well, this again appears in the late Hellenistic period. Let's say in the late 2nd century, we are in the same situation. However, between 586, the destruction of Judah, and let's say the rise of the more developed Hasmonean state in the second half of the 2nd century, there is a long period of time with almost no evidence of scribal activity in Yahud and Judea and early Judea. And this is something, I'm not saying that this is, something that needs to 100% dictate what we are saying. What I'm saying is that this cannot be brushed under the carpet, this piece of evidence. And this is an important piece of evidence that cannot be just said, well, okay, fine, forget it. And tomorrow morning we'll find, the archive and we'll deal with it. Yes, tomorrow morning we'll find an article and we will deal with it. However, today is today and tomorrow is tomorrow, and we have to deal always with what we have, not what we predict to be having next year or in 10 years from now, or the wishful thinking of what we wish to have in the future. Of course, there are many problems also with archaeology. Yes, and the third problem that haunts this period is the inability to investigate the Temple Mount. It is even more, this is from the archaeology point of view. This is even more serious than let's say, a similar problem for the Iron Age. Because for the Iron Age, the city in the 8th and 7th centuries BC was so big that the city can be investigated, Jerusalem, in other periods other than the Temple Mount. However, similar to the situation in the 10th century, in my opinion, and I'll get back to it later, in the Persian period too, and early Hellenistic, the settlement was mainly located in the Temple Mount, in my opinion, and hence the fact that we cannot excavate it is a big problem. Also reflecting on what I have just said about other things that annoy me regarding the Persian and early Hellenistic period. So these are the problems that I wish to put on the table before.
What do you expect on the Temple Mount?
I will say a few words about it later, okay, with your permission. So let me start with Jerusalem. I know that many of you are really into the details of archaeology in Jerusalem, but still I need to do some sort of an average here. So let me start with some basics about Jerusalem. So this is an aerial view of Jerusalem, showing you the topography and the three main components of the city, especially in the later phase of the Iron Age and in the late Hellenistic periods. The Temple Mount in purple, the City of David, quote unquote. Of course, we don't know the meaning of this, exactly the meaning of this title, but archaeologically speaking, it has been given to the ridge which goes offshoot, which goes from the Temple Mount to the south in yellow. This is the City of David. And then the Armenian and Jewish quarters of the old city, plus Mount Zion in red on the left-hand side. The upper city, as we call it in the daily spoken language of archaeology. So these are the three main components. And there were all sorts of previous theories regarding the population of Jerusalem and the extent of Jerusalem in the Persian and early Hellenistic period. One thing is quite for sure. Since 1967, when archaeological activity in Jerusalem accelerated, starting then, we know for sure that the settlement did not extend at that time to the upper city, which means to the red over here on the screen to the part on the left, which means that the settlement can be, if there is a settlement, it can be located only in the yellow and possibly in the purple. And for this, there have been all sorts of theories, and the theories, are different in scope, and people suggested all sorts of numbers for the population. The minimalists at that time spoke about, a town which has a population of 1,500 to 2,500 people, or 3,000 people, something like that. And as you'll hear in a minute, I think that this also is exaggerated a little bit for the Persian and Hellenistic periods. Let's see. So I'll show you now two pictures. This picture shows you, this is a picture that was taken in the 80s, I suppose. Today the area is more settled than then. And in blue, I show you the area where Persian period and early Hellenistic period, they go the same, basically. Persian and early Hellenistic pottery was found. I'm speaking about pottery. So the circle, especially the big one on the lower part, but also the small one. The small one marks excavations today. This is something new. Not exactly breaking news because it has been known for a while, but excavation that is being carried out in recent years to the south of the Dung Gate in the city wall of Jerusalem, in the Ottoman city wall, to the south of the Dung Gate. Dung Gate is somewhere where is the Dung Gate? Over here. Sorry, no, over here. So to the south or southeast of the Dung Gate, in the Givati parking lot, this is the title for the area, Persian and early Hellenistic pottery has recently been found. So we know a little bit more. However, please pay attention to the fact that in these areas, what was found is always here and there pieces of pottery and the typical seal impressions, I'll speak about them later, of the Persian period. But until today, not even maybe except for the Givati parking lot, but until today, no building, no wall, and no floor, which means no architectural elements whatsoever in the entire area for the Persian and early Hellenistic period. And this is something that cannot, I repeat, cannot be ignored. So it raises the question, where is the pottery coming from? What is this pottery? Because usually when you find pottery, you need to find also other remains on the ground. So this is a major problem for the Persian and early Hellenistic period that you need to keep in mind for the rest of the lecture. And now in the second, I show you the same picture, basically, with the same blue main part, but also in red with the areas which had been excavated but did not reveal any remain, not even pottery, for the Persian and early Hellenistic. Which means in these areas, let's say just as an example, K on the left-hand side, or A on the left lower, or 3, what happens is that one goes down, one encounters Byzantine, Roman, early Roman finds, and then late Hellenistic, and then immediately under the late Hellenistic, late Iron Age. Iron Age 2 BC, which means 8th, 7th centuries BC, okay? And then bedrock. That's it. So the whole era of the Persian and early Hellenistic period is missing. And this also cannot be ignored. Now the question is, of course, is it possible that the remains disappeared because of erosions and the like? The answer is absolutely no. Absolutely no, because I don't think that there was some sort of erosion master who had a scheme in mind and decided to pick up only the Persian period out in order to mislead me or others in the future. And since we agree that this is what I have just said is reasonable, so I mean, had there been erosion, the erosion would have, of course, affected also other periods, not only the Persian and early Hellenistic. So this is not an answer. Something must have been found. I mean, finds do not evaporate, right? Walls do not evaporate. Floors do not evaporate. Something must be there, and there is almost nothing. So we continue the size of the settlement and its population. So So the settlement, had there been a settlement, and this is, how to say, a maximalist view. Had there been a settlement, it could have been on this part of the red circle, but this is also a problem because there are no remains. So where is the settlement and how many people live there? So when I first published the article on Jerusalem in the Persian period a few years ago, I said, well, there could have been something small, not very densely populated and so on. Now I pull back from this idea, and I think that the settlement was only on the Temple Mount. So the possibility that the settlement was centered in the Temple Mount will be discussed later. I'll get back to it later. But this is the only solution. There's no other solution, because otherwise we are in a huge problem. By the way, parenthesis, the same goes for the 10th century BC.
This is Ir David?
The red is the middle of Ir David, and the blue is the Temple Mount. So the Temple Mount, by the way, is the only solution also for the 10th century. And by the way, sitting here in Zurich and seeing Axel here, I must say that Axel, was a pioneer in many ideas regarding the history of ancient Israel, including reviving an idea that was before, but putting it forward, when was it, maybe 15 years ago or so, about the fact that the core of the settlement was at the Temple Mount. And I must say that in the beginning, of course, I read his article and I was kind of hesitant about it, but several years later, I said to myself, well, he was right. This is the only way to understand things. This is the only solution for not only for the Persian period, but also for the problem of the 10th century, let's say, or for the late Bronze Age, for that matter. Because for the late Bronze Age maybe is the best example. Why? Because we have real-time evidence about Jerusalem in the Amarna period, Amarna tablets, and in the city of David there is no settlement in the late Bronze Age, not whatsoever. Here and there a shared, less than in the Persian period. So where is the settlement? Where is the settlement of Abdichipa, the petty king of Jerusalem at that time? The only solution is the Temple Mount, and I must tell you now already, because we'll get back to it later, this solution too is not easy. It is not devoid of major problems. So don't start celebrating yet. It's too early. It's too early. We'll have to see what to do with this. Now, we should not be surprised from the situation in Jerusalem. This is a table of the settlement situation in Yehud Judea, if you wish, simply collecting information from the surveys, excavations and surveys, north of Jerusalem, area of Jerusalem, and so on. And what you see, if you summarize the whole thing, the most important is the total built-up area in hectares, and the total built-up area in hectare is very minimal. All in all, and now we can take the result and multiply by a factor, by a coefficient. So I think that we all agree today, when we look at ethnographic evidence, ethno-historical evidence from recent generations before modern times, that one can safely, securely calculate something like 20 people per dunam or 200 people per hectare. So altogether, if you take the whole thing, one gets to about 12,000 people in Yehud Judea, in the entire area from the highlands of Benjamin down south to the area of Hebron, and from the Shephelah to the Dead Sea. So this is about a quarter of the population in this area before 586. And this is, of course, meaningful for problems that I'm not going to deal with today, but problems that haunted biblical scholarship and research on the history of ancient Israel, meaning of the number for the number of deportees from Judah, and the number of returnees to Yehud. Of course, there are, this is significant. And then, of course, to the whole question of the myth of the empty land. As you can see, the myth is not completely a myth. There was a major blow that Jerusalem and the highlands of Judea suffered after the Babylonian conquest. And this is definitely reflected in the archaeological finds. Of course, there is the problem that we don't have the tools yet to go into details of differences, let's say, between the 6th and 5th century or within the 6th century BC to tell you exactly what was the pace of deportations and dwindling of the population in Yehud, but the fact of the matter, if we take the, let's say, 600 BC and compare it to 450 BC, century and a half later, this is what we see. So on this background, I wish to deal now with several biblical texts which are important, I think, and which are very illuminating from this point of view. And the first one, and most of them are geographically based, which means these are, they have geographical information in them, and geographical information makes it possible to check them archaeologically, which means if sites are mentioned, one can go to the site and see whether the site is inhabited or not. So the geographical information is extremely important. So here's the description. I'm not going to read the description to you, the chapter to you, of course. Nehemiah chapter 3, the construction of the wall of Jerusalem. Now, as you know, all of you, I'm sure better than me, this chapter 3, has always been considered not as an integral part of what's called in biblical scholarship the Nehemiah memoir, which means it has been considered as some sort of a different text that was put into the memoir, incorporated into the memoir, and there was a big discussion. There has been a discussion regarding the date of this text, whether it is an original text that was put together with the memoir, whether it's an older text even, whether it's a later text. All sorts of ideas have been expressed. Now, in any event, there is a description of the wall of Jerusalem. Now, there is no wall in Jerusalem. There's nothing to do against it, except, of course, and then I hint again, except for what I don't know. What I don't know is, again, the Temple Mount. But the pieces which have been suggested during the last, 50, 60 years, or even more than that, as representing the wall of Nehemiah, this is not serious archaeology. Here is Canyon's, here's Canyon's wall of Nehemiah, and you see the location on the right-hand side. And here is the excavation of Crowfoot on the other side of the city of David. Please note, by the way, that the city of David here is only something where the red spot is only like 50, 60 meters wide. That's it, from side to side. And on the right-hand side, there is this one. And on the left-hand side, 60 meters away or so, there is another piece of architecture, this one. And that was presented as the valley gate mentioned, in the description of the wall in Nehemiah 3. However, both places cannot be considered as architecture of the Persian period or the early Hellenistic. Here, the potter Elat Mazar, now excavating in Jerusalem, repeated the canyon idea recently and rechecked the stratigraphy in the same area, as you can see on the left-hand side, canyon, on the right-hand side, Elat Mazar. It's about the same place. And she reached the conclusion that the wall is indeed from the Persian period. However, how did she do this? According to a pocket of pottery that was found under the wall, which dates, let's say, to the 6th century BC. However, if this pottery dates now, simple methodology in archaeology, if this pocket of pottery dates to the 6th century BC and it is under the wall could have been built also yesterday. Any time between the 6th century BC and today. There is no indication. It's only a terminus post quem. It only tells you, what's the earliest possible for the wall. Even this I'm not sure about. So this is not an argument. And not only that, we see, this is the place that we are speaking about, we see that this piece of architecture that I'm showing you over here on the right-hand side is part of the bigger picture of the wall of Jerusalem, which is Hellenistic. Whether it was built in the early 2nd century or in the late 2nd century, one can argue. There are several articles about it that have been published during the years. But this is part of the what we call the first wall of Jerusalem, an expression that comes from the description of Flavius Josephus. The first wall that Josephus says was built by Solomon, of course influenced by his reading of the Bible, and it is a late Hellenistic wall, city wall. So there is no wall over here. On the other side, the same. My colleague and friend David Yosishkin several years ago rechecked very thoroughly the discoveries or the results of the excavation of Crowfoot on the other side of the ridge, and came to the conclusion that is solid, I think, that the building is probably either late Hellenistic or early Roman. Then there's no gate there. It's a big structure from the late Hellenistic or early Roman period. There's no Persian period finds there. So this too is not part of a Persian period fortification. So here's the question: could a Persian period fortification have evaporated? I don't think so. It's stolen, yes, exactly. Here are 3 pictures of fortification systems in Jerusalem. One on the upper right side from the Middle Bronze Age. Yes, I think it's still Middle Bronze. I still think that it is Middle Bronze, but that's another question. Then on the left-hand side from the Iron Age, and then below from the late Hellenistic. They did not evaporate. So what's going on here? There is no remains. So theoretically speaking, one could argue that an ancient, let's say the Iron Age fortification system had been renovated. This is here is one example that had been raised in the past, excavations of Nachman Avigad in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem, which means in the west. However, there's no evidence for this. I mean, we should have seen something here or there, a little bit of pottery here or there, a floor which abuts the city wall from the inside, some sort of evidence, something small. There's nothing. It's an idea with no evidence whatsoever. Not only that, when one looks at the text of Nehemiah 3, one encounters other problems. And there are several of them, and they are significant. The first problem is about Bethsur. Bethsur is mentioned as a major place, one of the Chatzi Pelech, half district of the province of Yehud in the Persian period. However, when we look at the site of Bethsur, Khirbet Tebeke, north of Hebron, it had been excavated quite properly, and the finds have been presented. And when one looks at the finds, here and there, maybe there is a sherd from the Persian period. I'm not sure about it. But the site is mainly, as we saw before, for other sites, Iron 2, Iron 3, Iron 2C, whatever you want to call it, 7th century, 7th century on one side, below, and then late Hellenistic and later. So there is no Persian period fortification, there's no Persian period fortress at Bethsur. And when one reads very carefully the text that scholars wrote about Bethsur, they say, well, there are no Persian period, but there must be because of the texts. This is not an argument, of course, it's a secular argument that must be avoided. The same holds true for Gibeon. Here is Gibeon, which is also mentioned in the description of the construction of the wall. And Gibeon too does have 6th century. Why am I saying this? Because there are, those of you who are aware of the details, there are Moza seal impressions at Gibeon, and also a type of pottery which fits the 6th century, but not later. But the main body of the Persian period is missing at Gibeon. Gibeon was really intensively excavated by Pritchard. So the 5th and 4th and 3rd centuries are missing at Gibeon. There is an occupational gap probably there. Another problem is this one. There is the description of the wall in Nehemiah. Now, scholars usually, when they try to summarize the extent of the province of Yehud in the Persian period, they relied on this text. And then they argued whether, En-Gedi was part of it, whether the northern Shephelah was part of it, and so on. But the basic discussion, was about the text. However, there is a stronger way to look at these things, maybe, or at least as strong, and real-time piece of evidence, and these are the still impressions. As you know, there are those Yehud still impressions of different types, and the truth of the matter is that the distribution was not very clear until a few years ago. But lately, Oded Lipschitz, my friend and colleague at Tel Aviv University, and David Vanderhooft from Boston College assembled all the information. The nitty-gritty work of checking every one of the many hundreds of seal impressions that have been found and putting them on a map, and then according to types. So we get a very strong tool in order to investigate the extent of the province of Yehud and later Judea, because some of them, there's good evidence that some of them are from the Persian period. There's absolutely good evidence, and then there's evidence that some of them of the same kind of impressions, but not exactly the same type, in the early Hellenistic, late Persian, early Hellenistic, and then all the way down to the 2nd century. Some of them are even from the 2nd century. So we can look at their distribution and learn quite a lot. And when we look at the distribution of this one, for instance, over here, these are the Persian period Yehud seal impressions. 85% of them were found in Jerusalem, around Jerusalem itself and Ramat Rachel, or nearby. 85%. And 90% if we include all the way up to Mitzpah in Benjamin, a few kilometers farther to the north. But definitely, this layout does not fit the description of Yehud, or description of, Yehud in the time of Nehemiah, as it appeared ostensibly in chapter 3 in Nehemiah. Because you see, there's nothing at Bethsur, there's nothing in the Shephelah, there's nothing in the area of En-Gedi or Jericho, so it is limited to the area of Jerusalem. And this is the problem that needs to be taken into account. So there are three possibilities to interpret this situation. The first is to say that the whole thing is utopian. The description is utopian. They are speaking about, they took some sort of geographical reality from the Iron Age. Somebody saw the ruins of the Iron II city wall, the big city wall, including in the western part of Jerusalem, in the part of the upper city. But the actual description does not reflect actual work on the wall, only a utopian approach. Or that the Persian period author used an early source which described the late 8th century construction or a pre-586 renovation of the city wall and incorporated it into the Nehemiah text. And the third possibility is that the text was inspired by the construction of the late Hellenistic Hasmonean city wall. Very difficult to say. I suppose if you ask me for my gut feeling, yes, my gut feeling is that it is a combination of several things here. Maybe not utopian, but maybe indeed the reality of the big city wall, maybe a little bit of utopian approach on the side of the redactor who incorporated the text, and then of course the actual reality in a later period. And here I just would like to remind you and us, all of us, that the figure of Nehemiah appears in 2nd Maccabees, in the book, in the text of 2nd Maccabees, as a prominent figure in the restoration, a builder. This is a quote from Berggren from 20 years ago. So this also needs to be taken into consideration. Then, of course, there's the question why Nehemiah is all of a sudden important in the book of Maccabees. And there are several possible explanations to this. One of them is that Nehemiah represents non-Davidic rulership, which maybe was softer and easier to be accepted if indeed the text is in the time of Second Maccabees, definitely for the Hasmoneans.
But did the walls survive after 586, or they all total ruined?
The wall was in ruins, and it was there, so people could see it. And the wall, the Hellenistic wall, the Hasmonean wall, goes in line with this wall. In some places, it is really almost one on top, almost never the same, but almost one on top of the other. In other places, it diverges like in 10, 20 meters, something like that. But basically, it's the same layout: the late Iron Age and the late Hellenistic. And both are very well preserved, relatively speaking. Okay. Now, the problem is the following. Okay, fine. So what I'm trying to suggest to you is that the reality behind the description, maybe not the meaning, but the reality is taken from the late Hellenistic period, from the Hasmonean period. However, this is not easy to swallow a proposal like this, because the question is, would this mean that you need to pull or to push down the entire Nehemiah memoir to the 2nd century? In my opinion, as far as I understand, and as I told you, I'm not a biblical scholar, but I'm not completely ignorant, let's put it this way. And, my friends at Tel Aviv University, they say that I am, how to say, I don't know even whether I can pronounce it. It's a little bit insulting, but they say that I am a brutal, barbaric, I have a brutal approach, but with good senses. So I prefer to take the good senses. I don't think that my approach is brutal. So, as you can see, the question of the deplorable situation of Jerusalem and the deplorable fact that the city is not protected appears in other places which are part of the Nehemiah memoir. Before I told you, well, chapter 3 is not a problem. Why? Because chapter 3 was incorporated into the memoir. But now we are in the heart of the memoir, what we see here on the screen. Let's say Nehemiah 1 verse 3. And they say to me, the survivors there in the province who escaped exile are in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates are destroyed by fire. So there's this mention of the wall of Jerusalem, the deplorable situation of the walls of Jerusalem. However, in these verses that I mark here in red, never geographically specific, only the general atmosphere, that the situation is bad and something needs to be done about the wall of Jerusalem. So we have on one hand the wall of Jerusalem, theoretically speaking, or generally speaking, without specifics in the geography. And on the other hand, we have chapter 3 with the very specific mention of the places. And don't forget that Nehemiah 3 definitely describes a big wall because of the number of gates, because of the number of towers. It does not describe only a small wall. So, what to do? Here we come back to the Temple Mount and to our friend Axel here sitting with us, and to look at the Temple Mount. Well, I'm not going to go into details. We published this article in 2012, 7 years ago, and to my big surprise, it did not create too much discussion, which means that either the other scholars are kind of saying, well, they are crazy, forget about them, let's ignore them, or that there is something in what we are suggesting. Well, I think there's no escape from the idea that the mound of ancient Jerusalem is on the Temple Mount. Now, I'm not going to start with this. This is a completely different lecture. I have a long list of reasons why I'm saying this, and I think Axel will probably list the same items, but I think that there is no question about it. In my opinion, there can be no question about it. The actual mound of the Bronze Age, let's start with the Bronze Age, of the late Bronze Age, of Abdichipa of Amarna, of the 10th century. You see, at the end of the day, in Hebrew there is a saying, you know, in Hebrew slang, my daughters are also not young anymore, but they use it, afuch al afuch, which means the opposite of the opposite, okay? So, afuch al afuch, the opposite of the opposite, we are becoming now the great saviors of King David. Because, you know, of the not united monarchy, of the 10th century. Because otherwise there's nothing. So if one comes with the Temple Mount, this is a solution for the problem of Amarna, but also for the problem of the 10th century, because as far as I understand, there must be something there in the 10th century BC, and in the city of David there's almost nothing. So there is enough space there. Let me just say this. This is just, you know, my imagination, of course, what you see here. But the imagination is not too bad, and I on purpose, pulled back 50, 60 meters from the sides, from the box, the Herodian box, from the walls of King Herod the Great platform. Why is that? Because maybe there is not enough pottery from erosion. So, okay, 50, 60 meters, and then still I am being left with a mound of about 50, 55 dunams, 5 hectares, which would be one of the biggest mounds in the highlands. I'm excavating now together with the Collège de France, together with our friend Thomas Romer and others from Paris and also from Switzerland. There were people working with us. We are excavating at Kiryat Yarim. Kiryat Yarim is a big mound, and it is like something like 4.5 hectares. Here there is space for a bigger mound even within the compound of the Temple Mount. But note, this is what I wanted to tell you, that even in the Temple Mount, evidence for activity in the Persian period is not strong. How do we know this? I'm giving you here a picture of the work of the Waqf, of the Islamic Waqf in the Temple Mount, maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago. They cleaned under Al-Aqsa Mosque in the part which they call in Arabic Al-Aqsa al-Adima, which means old Al-Aqsa, and they prepared this as also a place of worship, of praying, and dirt was taken out and dumped somewhere in Jerusalem, and then there is a project of Israeli project of sifting through the dump from the Temple Mount, and the fact of the matter is that we don't know where the material was brought from. The material from under Al-Aqsa could have been brought in medieval times from anywhere, I don't know. But anyway, the number of Persian period shirts is small. But not only that. Here's a picture of the places that have recently been excavated or investigated around the Temple Mount with evidence for pottery, which means the excavations near the Wailing Wall, which is over here. Where is it? The Wailing Wall is here. Givati parking lot. Elat Mazar working over here, the Waqf project over here, and excavations here near the Lion's Gate. I mean, a check of the section near the Lion's Gate. In all of them, we have the same picture. Strong Iron Age, especially Iron 2 BC, strong late Hellenistic, early Roman, and so on, but weak in between. Here and there is, but weak. So even in the Persian period and early, even in the Temple Mount, the Persian and early Hellenistic is weak, although it could have been it must have been the core of the settlement in Jerusalem, and the focus of the Nehemiah memoir speaking about the walls, in fact speaking about the walls of the temple, of the core settlement in the Temple Mount of Jerusalem. So, but remember again that the core settlement was small relative to the big walls and relative to the description in Nehemiah 3, because Nehemiah 3, counting or judging or by the number of gates and number of towers mentioned, probably relate to the big wall, to the larger wall. So still, I think, late Hellenistic. This takes me, what time is it? It's okay. This takes me, I'll go on for 20 minutes and then we stop wherever we are. This takes me to the list of returnees, because my interest grew as a result of dealing with the Persian, with Nehemiah 3. I said to myself, well, if this is the situation regarding Nehemiah 3, my appetite became stronger, as you can imagine, and I said to myself, let's have a look at other geographical lists in Ezra and Nehemiah. And the most obvious to relate to is the list of returnees in Ezra 2 and Nehemiah 7. Here the situation is the same and not the same, because the evidence is not as strong, but there is evidence there too. So what I did, I took the list of returnees, and I went through it, and I identified I picked up all the places that are mentioned, which are identifiable, which means that I can check the archaeology. And the list of identifiable places is this. So we go from, you see, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Gibeon, Anatot, Azmavet, Kiryat Yarim, Kefira, Beerot, and so on. And then I checked the information from excavations and surveys regarding the volume of activity. And as you can see, volume of activity was strong in the Iron Two, in all of them, apparently, was strong almost in all of them, strong or medium in almost all of them in the late Hellenistic. And the Persian period is a problem, because some of them, the evidence for activity is weak, and some of them had not been settled at all. There's no Gibeon in the Persian period. There is no evidence from Anatot. Now, if you speak about Anatot, remember the following. The results of the survey, many years ago I accepted to be the editor of the publication of the surveys in the land of Benjamin. So my condition was that I don't believe anybody. I want to see the pottery. So I was sitting in days and days and days in Jerusalem and looking at the pottery and seeing whether the surveyors who were younger than me, whether they got it right. I think they were good. In any event, we counted also the pottery. And Anatot produced something like 500 sherds. It's not a matter of 20 sherds out of which there is nothing from the Persian period. There is a big body of evidence in a place like Anatot in the survey, if I take an example. What else? Bethel is a very good example, because Bethel had been excavated. That you know that I have my own views about Bethel, which are not very popular also with Axel. Malheureusement. But I am insisting on Bethel. And in any event, the Persian period does not exist in Bethel. There is one sherd, perhaps, that was found near the spring many years ago, perhaps, of a Greek Lakitos, that was published by Eilif, in the 30s or something like that. But in the excavation, there's nothing. So, as you can see, the evidence is, let's put it this way, cannot be ignored, okay?
What does V mean?
V existing. That I cannot say whether it's strong or not. No, because sometimes I cannot. Yeah, sometimes, I'm frank about it. If I cannot, I cannot. So I only say existing. Yeah, that's it. Yes, this is the V. So here's the map. So forget about number one, which is also a question, but look at number 2 and 3 here. Missing from the list are 4 of the 5 sites. Listen very carefully. Missing from the list are 4 of the 5 sites which yielded the largest quantity of Persian period Yehud seal impressions. Mitzpah, En-Gedi, Ramat Rachel, and Nebi Samuel. The sites. We don't know about, for sure, the identification, but the identification of Ramat Rachel we probably know, En-Gedi and Mitzpah for sure. And then look at it in the blue. 7 of the places in the list appear in the books of Maccabees, including important places in the history of the Hasmoneans, such as Beerot, Michmash, and Hadid especially. The appearance in the list of Lod, Hadid, and Ono is also significant, and so on. So here too, there is reason to say that the list does not reflect the reality of the Persian period. It reflects some sort of reality, if there is reality. One again can say, I mean, my friend Oded Lipschitz says, well, forget it. I mean, they picked up names from the text, from the layers of the text which are late Iron Age in date, and they picked up the names and they put them into a list. Okay, what can I say about it? There's nothing to say. Fine, if this is the situation, I pull back. But if one is looking for some sort of reality, I mean, there is no escape from this, from saying that the list of returnees also creates a major problem when one tries to date it to the Persian period or early Hellenistic. Let me have a very short excursus now, which will serve us in the continuation of the discussion. I'll do it very quickly. The expansion of Yehud Judea from the Persian period to the days of the Hasmoneans. Can we really do this? Can we really evaluate the expansion of Judea? So what are the tools to do this? So there are three tools. First of all, there are the descriptions in the book, in Maccabees and in Josephus. So of course we have to be careful with these descriptions, but they are there. We need to evaluate them. Then there are extra biblical descriptions. For instance, for the 3rd century, the Zenon papyri, as an example. Okay, and then not very many, but there are a few. And then there is the archaeology evidence, especially the seal impressions. So let's see what we can reach. So this is a table that I prepared many years ago to show the distribution of the seal impressions according to type, which means I basically took the evidence from the Oded Lipschitz, David van der Hooft book, first of all articles and then book. So they did a fantastic job in collecting all this information, and I'm using this information. So as I told you before, this is the situation for the Persian period. The Persian period seal impressions are only near Jerusalem. Jerusalem and Ramat Rachel, which was an important place in the Persian period. Then when we shift from here to the 3rd century, so you see that the scope of appearance of the late Persian, early Hellenistic seal impressions, which means the later types, a little bit later types, their distribution is in a territory a bit bigger than the territory I described before, but still not very big, because remember that Zenon in the papyri refers to Maresha and Adoraim as located in Idumea. Adoraim should be looked for somewhere here, and Maresha somewhere here. So they are outside of Judea. And then we can look at the situation in the 60s of the 2nd century. How do we do this? Again, we can count on either texts or finds. In this case, I'm showing the text, which means I'm putting on a map the location of the battles described in 1st Maccabees, and also the location of the places which are mentioned in several verses in the book of Maccabees as the locations fortified by the Seleucid general Bakrides in the 60s. So you see that we are still at that time in a limited area of the highlands around Jerusalem, which means Judea is not growing yet. However, this is what happened immediately thereafter. Immediately thereafter, we have the following. And I have to admit here, because we are in the later phases of the 2nd century, I count mainly on the texts. So there is some sort of a difficulty here. We have to take it into consideration. I count on 1 Maccabees and Josephus. Okay? So we have evidence for the extension of Simeon, and then Jonathan, who gets the 3 toparchies to the north of Jerusalem, and then John Hyrcanus. And in fact, this is important to remember. This is the only reason for showing you the slides, the last 5 screens, is to come to this map over here and to tell you that the kingdom, the states, the Hasmonean state of John Hyrcanus stretched from the area south of Hebron in the south to the area of Shechem in the north, after he took over the temple of Samaria, even a little bit farther, but the temple of the Samaritans in Mount Gerizim, and from the Shephelah in the west, almost the coastal plain, depends where, but Shephelah for sure, to the Jordan, and then one area in Transjordan. That was also, according to the text, incorporated into the Hasmonean state at his time. So, on this background, we can deal, I have like 10 minutes. So, on this background, we can deal with a few more texts, important and interesting texts. The first one is the adversaries of Nehemiah. And here I will be brief with your permission because I wish to try to wrap it up soon, the discussion. So, the adversaries of Nehemiah is a very interesting case. Because here too, one can make distinction between naming them. There are few places where they are being named, the adversaries. As you can see here, Sanballat the Horonite, and Tobiah the servant, the Ammonite, and Geshem the Arab, and then the Ashdodites are mentioned without a name of a ruler. And this is in certain places. However, these places also are questionable regarding their incorporation originally in the Nehemiah memoir. And in the Nehemiah memoir, there is reference to adversaries, but it is general, without naming names. So we are sort of the same situation as we were with the problem of the fortification of Jerusalem. That there is the concept on one hand and the details in texts which do not apparently belong to the original Nehemiah memoir. So for this, this is the concept of the enemies roundabout. Scholars noticed this and wrote about this in recent years. Several articles discuss this. And this concept appears in Nehemiah 6:16, where there's the concept of the enemies roundabout without names, and it is also a concept in the book of Maccabees, right in the beginning of the book of Maccabees, in chapter 1, verse 11. So here too, I suggest that the same thing. I don't have the time to go into this, but I think that one can also show it when we go into details, that there is reason to argue that the naming of the adversaries comes from a later layer in the book of Nehemiah, probably from the 2nd century. It makes sense regarding Tobiah, and it makes sense also regarding the Ashdodites. I mean, just think about it. What do they, what does Nehemiah have to do with the Ashdodites, far away from here, from Jerusalem? Whereas we know that from the first book of Maccabees, that the Hasmoneans were in a clash with Ashdod, with the Ashdodites in the 2nd century BC. This takes me, again, I don't want to go into too many details and I wish to wrap it up. I am saying the same about the genealogies, and now I don't have time to really elaborate. I would just say that my method regarding the genealogies, you can pick up the book and have a look. The genealogies is the same situation. Archeologically speaking, there are many places here which can be identified, and many of them have not been settled at all in the Persian period. Look at the table below. 11 of the places are not settled in the Persian period. And also the stretch, the geographical distribution is interesting. Look at it. The geographical distribution is from the area south of Hebron to Shechem, and from the Shephelah to Nebo, Baal Meon, Madaba in the east. So just to remind you, this is exactly what I told you, that this is the boundary of the Hasmonean state in the second half of in the late 2nd century in the time of John Hyrcanus, and I think, in my opinion, that I'm not going to read all this, that the genealogies have to do with the legitimacy to the expansion of the Hasmoneans, especially in the days of Hyrcanus, but starting in the time of Simeon and Jonathan, and more in the time of Hyrcanus, to territories which had big non-Jewish population and needed legitimacy, and they took the legitimacy from the from leaning from or drawing legitimacy from the genealogy, which means from the time of the First Temple, and this also is part of what I have been doing regarding these texts. I wanted to say something else about it, but yes, just to remind you that there is a certain similarity between the attitude of the genealogies and the idea of looking for legitimacy in the First Temple period, also when one looks at other second century works such as Jubilees and the 12th part of the Testament of the 12 tribes and so on. Well, I think that I will just say a few words here without the presentation. And I say the same thing about the list of fortified cities of Rehoboam in 2 Chronicles, but 2 Chronicles is even more important than Rehoboam. It is a bigger question. And this is maybe the most for me, it was the most interesting article to write. This was the last that I published. It was published in 2015 in ZAW. And I said to myself, I must tell you that I felt bad about what I was doing, because I said to myself, hey, Finkelstein, you go into territory which is not exactly yours, and what are you doing here? I mean, they will eat you alive, all of you, all of them. So I said, I have enough good friends to protect me. So once the article was done, I sent the article to 3 scholars. I sent the article to my friend Konrad Schmidt. I sent it to Thomas Romer, and I sent it to an expert in Second Temple Judaism, a professor at the Hebrew University, Doron Mendels, a very great scholar of second century Judea and second century texts. And I sent the text and I went into the basement. I said, well, I better be in the shelter because they will now jump on my throat to kill me. And the reaction was very mild. So I came out of the shelter and I said, well, what's going on here? The reaction, Doron Mendel said, fantastic, wonderful. This is what I have always thought. And Konrad and Thomas tried to resist, I must say, but not very fiercely. So I know how to gauge. I have enough experience in the last 50 years to know when scholars in the scope of Konrad and Thomas, whom I also respect as very frank and open-minded, I know how to gauge the reaction. So the reaction was very mild. So I said to myself, well, maybe I can publish this. I'm okay. So I published it with the claim that I looked at one thing. I looked at the texts in the second book of Chronicles, which do not exist in the book of Kings. And they describe the territorial expansion of the kingdom of Judah in the Iron Age, from the time of Rehoboam all the way to the later kings. And my conclusion was that what we see in Chronicles is basically a legitimacy text to the expansion of the Hasmoneans in the 2nd century BC. Finally, and this is why I'm cutting short over here, finally I wish just to come to where I started and remind you the following. The major problem that has not, until today, is again and again brushed under the carpet by scholars, unfortunately, and this is that we do not have evidence for scribal activity, for literacy in Jerusalem and Yehud in the Persian period and early Hellenistic. Now, do not please misunderstand me. I'm not coming here to argue that there was no scribal activity whatsoever, because it doesn't make sense. If there is strong activity in the Iron Age and then it starts again in the 2nd century, there must be something in between to carry the torch, so to speak. However, the evidence is very meager, extremely meager. The evidence, as I am showing you here, between 586 and 350, for instance, not a single inscription has been found for this period, not an ostracon, not a seal impression, not a bulla. There are just a few coins. But coins are a problem of themselves.
You had a picture of the recently found bulla from the Temple Mount sifting project from the Persian period.
Okay, so I forgot that one. There is a bulla from the sifting project that dates to when?
Persian period.
Persian period. I need to.
The inscription was recently popularized, and there is at least one Persian period ostracon from Jerusalem.
But not from an excavation.
No. Well, I have to check, but it's in CIIP.
Yeah, but this is a problem. I mean, there are hundreds of ostraka from the Shefela, which I look at them always and I don't know what to do with them. Big problem, but anyway, okay, I don't remember right now the seal from the sifting project, but basically, even if there is one or two, I mean, the picture is very clear that the volume of activity is very low for the Persian and early Hellenistic periods, and then what I wanted to tell you is only what you see at the end. My humble advice is therefore twofold. To try to date as much material as possible to periods in Judea that demonstrate widespread scribal activity and literacy in all media and all forms of inscriptions, that is, the latest phase of the Iron Age and late Hellenistic period, after 200, or for the period between 600 and 200, especially the Babylonian and Persian periods, to place as much compilation as possible in Babylonia. Thanks.
All this is in your book.
Yes, all this is in the book. I mean, I published in the starting maybe 10 years ago, I published maybe 10 articles on this subject, one after the other, because it was like a chain of events. One article drew my attention to another problem and so forth. And then I decided to put them together in a book because I wanted the impact, which means as a well-known troublemaker, I said to myself, if I don't put them together in a book, the ideas will disappear one way or the other. So in order to be really a bad boy, I need to put them together and put it to the test of scholarship.
Sir, your told short of the Mount of the Temple about excavations is not possible. What do you expect? Again, I'm asking, when you had an excavation under the Mount of Sinai.
Had we been able to excavate today, we need to make a distinction between excavations today or tomorrow, meaning is Third World War. But let's say that we take the risk, okay? And who knows? So, excavations today and excavations in the year 35 BC, to be on the safe side. Two excavations. You'll understand immediately. In the year 25 BC, which means before the period of Herod the Great, I took a few years just to be on the safe side, which means before the big operation that changed the shape of the Temple Mount forever. Remember, please, the Temple Mount is the biggest single construction operation in the history of the land of Israel. You know something? The Southern Levant, until today, including. There has never been something like that. Which means the mount was, first of all, chopped off. The Temple Mount, because the Temple Mount was like that, and Herod the Great wanted to construct the platform. So the big walls, the Wailing Wall and the other walls, fills, some of them full fill, some of them on vaults, and chopping off the top. So in the year 35 BC, I would have expected to find remains of a mound with remains from the early bronze, middle bronze, late bronze, iron 1, iron 2, and later, and also perhaps surrounded by a wall. Why for the Iron Age? Why am I saying this? Because in the 9th century, there are already walls in Judah, in places such as Lachish, Bet Shemesh, Arad, Beersheba, and in my opinion also Tel Nasbe, Mitzpah, to the north of Jerusalem. However, in Jerusalem, in the city of David, the wall is only from the 8th century. So what's going on here? The capital of the kingdom is not protected by a wall in the 9th century, not to mention that in those of you who want to go back to the text, in 2 Kings, 13 or 14, I forgot, that when Joash attacks Amaziah, he breaks the wall of Jerusalem in a chronistic verse in the story. So I would have expected to see a 9th century wall, for instance, there, and maybe also later. However, had I been able to excavate today, I would have found very little, in my opinion, which means much pottery on the slope. But the top of the mound is, in my opinion, completely destroyed. And maybe had I been able to excavate, maybe we would have been able to find traces of walls here and there in the fields. I don't know, but very little.
No rest of the Temple of Solomon.
I don't think so.
I don't think so too. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah. I guess my main question, and I'm a little bit shaky on the precise datings, but if we push the Bible, like, let's say larger parts of the Bible into the Maccabees, doesn't that start to clash with the Qumran material?
Well, this is a big question. First of all, I don't push the Bible. I push certain chapters in the... Even for the book of Chronicles, I am aware of the problem and I'm very careful. For instance, for the major description of the time of David, of King David, I'm not sure that can be treated in the same way. So I'm trying to be careful with sweeping, claims, assertions. So even for Chronicles, I would not push everything. I would leave a possibility that there is part of it that is a bit earlier. I don't think that the part is as early as, let's say, Frank Moore Cross thought many years ago, but earlier than the 2nd century. So I'm not, and the same holds true. For instance, as I told you, I always have to repeat this. I'm not a biblical scholar, okay, don't forget, but still, I think that the Nehemiah memoir, as I understand it, and I have my own notion on the Nehemiah memoir. I've never published it, but I have my secret files in my computer, always colored, with colors and so on and so forth. So my understanding of the Nehemiah memoir is also as an earlier text, not from the 2nd century BC. So I'm not pushing everything. And of course, when we come to other parts in the historical, quote-unquote, parts of the Hebrew Bible, it's a different story altogether. So, however, I wish just to answer you that the question regarding 2nd Chronicles was on my table. And I started with that. Because when I started to go into Chronicles, I read all the books, there are many of them. And most of them give you a list of reasons why Chronicles must be before 200 BC. And the list is big. I'm not going to give you all of it, but one of the funniest of them all is the question of Polemos. I'll get back to it in a minute. And then I started looking into the kind of evidence and arguments, and I said to myself, well, the arguments are not solid, because first and foremost, we don't really always have the text of the 2nd century full. So we don't know. Even if, let's say, Chronicles is mentioned in Qumran. So then the question is the date, of course. And then the question is what part of Chronicles is mentioned. And there are so many issues there that nothing, in my opinion, stands firmly. And this is part that I was really ready to take the heat when I sent it to my friends to evaluate. And on this, they were completely quiet. There is a very big chapter there, dismissing these arguments. And at the end of the day, of course, I'm not going to date Second Chronicles to the Roman period, but to say whether it is post 200 or close to 200 or a little bit before is very difficult. Eupolemus is a very good question, because we are dealing here with, there are like 10, I don't know whether you are aware of it, that the question of Eupolemus, that is citing Chronicles, and he ostensibly lived in the 60s of the 2nd century, so Chronicles must be there before the 60s of the 2nd century and so on. But there are about 10 ifs on the way. And if you take one if out, the whole thing collapses. Let me give you the example. Do we know that this Eupolemus, which we don't have, by the way, but we read about it from Eusebius, from later texts, So is this Eupolemus indeed the same Eupolemus that was ostensibly sent by Judah to deal with the Romans and so on? I mean, there are so many ifs there on the way that, what can I say? What can I say? Yes, I wanted to, what was it? There was something that I wanted to say to wrap it up regarding this question. Yes, just to remind you that there were several scholars that really tried to push low. And, I am just a small cockroach compared to them. One of them is Martin Noth, who went to the 3rd century. And the other one, whom people forget, is one verse, where Spinoza says that Chronicles is a Hasmonean work. So you read this verse and you are amazed, to see the background of this man and the understanding and so on. So, and there were a few others that really opted, at least raised the possibility that Chronicles, or at least parts of Chronicles, need to be lowered in date. I'm not the first.
This is not my field. What do you do with Ramat Rachel and what has been done?
Louder.
What do I do with Ramat Rachel and what has been done? Ramat Rachel is a great site and a great excavation and a very important one, for instance, in giving us a huge body of information about the seal impressions, but I don't think that it has a one-to-one impact on the questions that I raised here. You can live with Ramat Rachel this way or that way. I don't think that it stands in the way.
I think I've heard the argument that
I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
the quote-unquote Persian administration was in Ramat Rachel and not in Jerusalem.
That's a possibility, but does not reflect on, dating texts, geographical texts in Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. Yes, I agree, there is strong possibility for this. But again, it depends on what we don't know more than on what we know, because then the question would be again the Temple Mount. Always back to the Temple Mount regarding the administration and what's going on and how to understand Ramat Rachel and so on. So,
Thank you.
okay, thanks a lot. I promise that the next seminar will be very different. And I promise also one more thing. The next seminar that we are doing on the Negev, part of it is, I'm speaking here to those who were in Bern a few years ago when I lectured about it. It's a different story today, because I'm coming with a big pile of evidence for the 3rd millennium BC, and I will make more sweeping arguments for the history of the South and so on and so forth. So it will be very different from what you heard a few years ago. Thanks.